The last cage, the alien slave market, was almost empty now. The sun was sinking low, its orange light spilling over rows of metal cages. Dust floated in the air, and the ground smelled of old blood and sweat. Traders laughed loudly as they counted coins and packed up their goods. The day's business was over, and every cage had been cleared. Every cage. Except one, in the farthest corner of the market. Away from the noise, a single cage still held someone. A small alien girl sat inside, her knees pulled tight against her chest. Her thin arms were wrapped around her legs, and her head was lowered. So her hair covered her face. She was barefoot, dressed in torn fabric that might once have been clothes. Her skin was pale under the dirt, and there was a strange, faint shimmer on her wrist that no one seemed to notice. The auctioneer, a fat alien with 3 eyes and gold rings on his fingers, stood in front of the cage. He had been trying to sell her all day. Now his voice was tired, his words sharp with frustration. Last one for the day. He called out, "Cheap price. You can use her for cleaning, for work, anything? She's quiet and obedient enough." A few traders turned to look, but most kept walking. The girl didn't move. She didn't look up. It was as if she had already accepted that no one would want her. From the crowd, a human man stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a simple dark coat and boots dusty from travel. His face was calm, almost expressionless, but his eyes cold gray rested on the girl with an intensity that made the auctioneer pause. The man didn't speak at first, just stood there, looking at her. The auctioneer quickly began his usual talk, trying to hide his surprise. "She's not much, but she cost you almost nothing. Take her before I throw her to the beasts," he said with a half-laugh. The man still didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer to the cage. The girl finally raised her head. Her eyes were a deep, strange color like molten gold under shadow, and for a moment they locked with his. Something in that brief look made the man's jaw tighten. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small pouch. The coins inside clinked softly as he tossed it to the auctioneer. "I'll take her," the man said quietly. It wasn't loud, but the words cut through the market noise. The traders nearby turned to stare. Some laughed under their breath, others shook their heads. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. Most buyers would bargain for half price, but this man had paid without question. Still, greed was stronger than curiosity, and the auctioneer quickly unlocked the cage. The girl hesitated before stepping out. Her bare feet touched the cold ground, and she looked around as if expecting someone to stop her. The man didn't touch her, didn't force her forward. He simply turned and began walking away. After a moment, she followed, keeping several steps behind. The auctioneer watched them go, his 3 eyes narrowing. Then he looked toward a dark alley on the edge of the market. 2 shadowy figures stood there, watching the human and the girl. They nodded once before melting back into the darkness. The market noise faded behind them as they walked through the winding streets. The girl's steps were slow and uneven. Every time someone passed, she shrank back as if expecting a blow. The man glanced over his shoulder once, noticing how far back she walked. "Keep close," he said in a steady voice. She moved forward a little, but didn't speak. Her silence was heavy, as though she had forgotten how to use her voice. They passed a row of small shops where the air smelled of warm bread and roasted meat. The man stopped at a stall and bought 2 pieces of flatbread wrapped in cloth. He handed one to her. She didn't take it immediately, only stared at it suspiciously. "Eat," he said simply. After a long pause, she reached out and took it. Her hands were thin and shaking, and when she finally bit into the bread, her eyes flickered with something surprise, maybe even relief. The sun had almost disappeared when they reached the edge of the town. Beyond the last row of buildings was a dirt road leading toward the dark hills. The man stopped and looked at her again. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "No name." Ku, he said, his brow furrowing. After a moment of thought, he spoke a name softly. As if testing how it sounded, she blinked, and for a split second her lips parted as if to speak. But no words came. Still, her eyes seemed to hold that name now, as though she had claimed it. As they continued down the road, the night air grew colder. The girl pulled the torn fabric tighter around herself. The man adjusted his coat, but didn't speak again. Behind them, somewhere far back in the streets, quiet footsteps followed for a while, then stopped in the distance. The hills loomed like black shadows under a thin moon. The road ahead was empty. But for reasons neither of them could explain, it felt as if something or someone was waiting. The road stretched ahead, in silence. The only sounds were the crunch of the man's boots and the softer, hesitant steps of the girl behind him. The night air was cold, carrying the faint smell of smoke from distant chimneys. A thin moon hung above, pale and sharp in the dark sky. The man glanced back at her now and then. She kept her eyes on the ground, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The name he had given her earlier still hung in the air between them. He wasn't even sure why he had chosen it. It was a name from an old story his grandmother told him when he was young. A name belonging to a lost princess who had wandered through strange lands. When he had spoken it, the girl's reaction had been small but noticeable. They stopped at a quiet bend in the road where a patch of grass sloped down toward a stream. The man set his small pack down and knelt, pulling out a worn blanket and a pouch of water you should drink, he said, passing it to her. She hesitated again. Every action from her was slow, as if she was waiting for a trap. Finally, she took the pouch and drank in small, careful sips. When she handed it back, he noticed her hands shaking. "Are you cold?" he asked. She didn't answer, but her slight nod was enough. He handed her the blanket. She wrapped it around her shoulders, her golden eyes peeking over the edge. The man sat across from her on the grass, the stream murmuring softly beside them. "You understand me, don't you?" She gave the smallest nod. "Can you speak?" She stayed quiet for a long time, then whispered something so soft he almost missed it. Yes, her voice was weak, rough, like she hadn't spoken in weeks, maybe months. He leaned forward slightly. "Do you want to tell me where you came from?" She shook her head quickly, almost fearfully. "All right," he said simply. Leaning back, he didn't push her. There was no rush, but something inside him told him that whatever her past was dangerous. After a while, she spoke. Again, her voice so small it barely carried over the sound of the stream. "Why did you take me?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Because no one else would," he said. "And I didn't like the way they looked at you." She seemed to study him for a long time after that, her expression unreadable. Then she pulled the blanket tighter and looked away. They set up camp beside the stream. The man gathered sticks for a fire while she stayed close to the blanket. When the fire finally burned, its warm light touched her face for the first time. He could see her better. Now her skin had a faint, unnatural shimmer under the dirt. And there, on her left wrist, was the same strange mark he had noticed earlier at the market. It glowed faintly in the firelight. "What's that on your wrist?" he asked. She quickly pulled the blanket over her hands, hiding it. "It's nothing," she said too fast, but her voice trembled, and he knew it wasn't the truth. The night deepened, and the forest beyond the stream grew quiet. The man lay back on the ground, one arm behind his head, staring at the stars. The girl stayed sitting for a while, watching the flames. He could feel her glancing at him now and then, as if trying to decide whether he was a danger or the first safe person she had met in a long time. Sometime after midnight, when the fire had burned low, the man's eyes drifted shut. The girl lay down too, curling into the blanket, for the first time in what felt like forever. She let her eyes close without fear, but while she slept, the mark on her wrist pulsed faintly, far away in the shadows of another city. A cloaked figure felt that same pulse through a strange device. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. So, he whispered to himself, the last one lives. Back at the camp, the man stirred in his sleep. A chill passed through the air, though the fire still burned. Somewhere deep inside, he knew their meeting at the market was no accident, and before this journey ended, the name he had given her might become more important than he could imagine. Morning came slowly. The first light of dawn touched the hills and spilled over the quiet stream. The man woke early, his hand instinctively checking for the small knife at his belt. The girl was still asleep, curled under the blanket, her hair covering most of her face. For a moment, she looked peaceful like any other young traveler resting on a journey. But the mark on her wrist, still faintly visible through the blanket, reminded him she was not just any traveler. He stirred the fire back to life and warmed a piece of bread. The smell must have reached her because she opened her eyes, blinking in the pale light. "You should eat," he said simply. She sat up, slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders before taking the bread. They ate in silence, the only sounds the soft crackle of the fire and the rushing of the stream. By mid-morning, they were back on the dirt road, heading toward the next town. The girl walked a little closer now, though she still kept her eyes down. The man noticed small changes. Her steps were more steady, her shoulders not as tense as yesterday. But the feeling of being watched had not left him. More than once, he glanced behind them. Each time, the road was empty. Still, he had the sense that somewhere, just out of sight, someone was keeping pace. When they reached the town, the streets were already busy. Merchants called out their prices, carts rattled over uneven stones, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh fruit filled the air. The man guided her through the crowd, his hand never far from his side where his weapon rested. It was then that he noticed something strange. Several people were staring at the girl. Not with pity like in the market, but with a mix of surprise and fear. One old vendor froze mid-sentence when she saw the girl, then quickly turned away. Another, a young man selling cloth, lowered his eyes and muttered something in a language the human didn't understand. The girl seemed to notice too, because she pulled the blanket hood over her head. "Keep it on," he told her, "and stay close." They stopped at a small shop for supplies, dried food, rope, and a water flask, while the man paid. He caught sight of a figure in a dark cloak standing just outside. The hood covered most of their face, but he could see the faint reflection of eyes watching them. The moment he stepped toward the door, the figure turned and disappeared into the crowd. They left the shop and made their way toward the edge of the town. The streets grew quieter, the noise of the market fading behind them. But just before they reached the last row of buildings, they passed a narrow alley where two alien merchants stood, speaking in low voices. The human wasn't trying to listen at first, till he heard a word that froze him in his tracks. "The last heir," one whispered. "The bounty is enough to buy a fleet." The other replied. They both glanced toward the street, and though the man pretended to look away, he knew they were talking about the girl. He kept walking, his mind racing. When they were far enough from the alley, he leaned down slightly toward her. "Is there something you haven't told me?" "Ha?" he asked in a low voice. She tensed instantly, her hands clutching the blanket tighter. "What do you mean?" she said softly. "That mark," he replied. "The way people look at you, the way some follow us. Who are you really?" Her lips parted as if to answer, but then a loud bang shook the wooden door of the small inn they had just stepped into. The girl's eyes went wide, her body going rigid. The man turned sharply toward the sound, his hand already on his weapon. Another bang, this time strong, rattled the door. Voices shouted from outside, speaking a language he didn't know, but with a tone that needed no translation, demand and threat. The man quickly pulled the girl toward the back of the room. "Stay behind me," he said firmly. The lock splintered under the third hit. The door swung open, and shadowed figures stepped inside. Weapons glinting in the dim light, the man's jaw tightened. Whoever they weren't here to bargain or talk. They were here for her, and they weren't going to leave without a fight. Asterisk, the wooden floor shook under heavy boots. 3. Masked figures stepped into the inn, their weapons drawn, their eyes visible through narrow slits, locked instantly on the girl. She froze, her back pressed against the wall, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. The faint glow of the mark on her wrist caught the dim light, and one of the intruders hissed in recognition. The man stepped in front of her without hesitation. His hand gripped the worn handle of his. "Blade, leave," he said in a cold voice. The leader of the masked men tilted his head slightly, almost amused. "You don't know what she is, human." The voice was low and harsh. "I know enough," the man replied, his eyes never leaving theirs. Without another word, the first attacker lunged. Steel clashed with steel, the sound ringing. Through the small room, the man blocked the strike and shoved his opponent back. But another came from the side. Swinging a short blade, he ducked and countered, his elbow slamming into the attacker's ribs. The third man tried to push past him toward the girl. "Run." The man barked over his shoulder, but she didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the fight, fear rooting her in place. The attackers were skilled, but the human was faster. He fought with sharp, efficient movements. Each strike meant to end the fight quickly. Still, he was outnumbered, and one blade sliced across his arm, drawing a line of red. He didn't flinch. Grabbing a chair, he swung it hard. Knocking one of them into the wall, another came at him with a roar, but the man stepped aside, tripping him with his boot, sending him crashing into a table. The leader saw the fight turning and signaled the others. They backed toward the door, but his voice carried a promise. "This isn't over," he growled. "The bounty will follow you both to the ends of the stars." Then they were gone, their footsteps fading into the street outside. The man quickly turned to the girl. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her breathing fast. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They were full of guilt, fear, and something else. "Resignation. You know why they came?" he said, his tone leaving no room for lies. Her lips trembled, but this time she didn't. "Look away. I am the daughter of the last queen," she whispered, her voice barely more than air. "The queen they killed." The man asked. She nodded, tears glistening in her golden eyes. "They burned the palace, killed my family. But I escaped. My mother hid me before they found her." The man felt the weight of her words settle over him. He understood now why the merchants in the alley had spoken of an heir, why strangers in the market had turned away in fear, and why the hunters would not stop. "They won't stop until you're dead," he said quietly. She looked at him, her voice breaking. "Please, don't leave me." For a moment, he didn't speak. The easy choice would be to walk away now, leave her, vanish, and let the galaxy's politics devour itself. But the memory of her in that cold cage, eyes lowered, waiting for the world to end, made the choice for him. "Then I won't," he said, his voice firm. Her shoulders shook with relief, and she pulled the blanket back around her. He began gathering their things quickly. "We move now," he said, "before more come." They slipped out through the back of the inn, the streets still wet from a recent rain. The man led her through narrow alleys, keeping to the shadows. Behind them, distant voices shouted, orders, searching, spreading, hunting. The girl stayed close, this time her hand gripping the edge of his coat as they ran. By the time they reached the outskirts, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The man knew the danger was far from over. This was no longer just a rescue, it was a chase. And they were now running from an enemy who would never stop. Far behind them, in the dark streets, they had Left, the leader of the masked hunters stood with a communicator pressed to his ear. His voice was cold and certain. "They're heading for the hills," he said. "Send more men alive or dead. Bring me the girl." The hills rose ahead, dark shapes against the fading light. The man led the girl along a narrow path, their boots crunching over loose stones. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and distant pine. Every few steps, he glanced behind them. The road was empty. But he knew the hunters wouldn't be far. They climbed until the path turned into rough ground scattered with rocks. The girl's breathing grew heavy, but she didn't complain. She kept her hood up, her eyes on his back. The blanket was still wrapped around her, though the edges were now torn from the run. By nightfall, the clouds had gathered thick and low. The first drops of rain fell cold against their skin. Within minutes, the drizzle became a downpour. Soaking them through, the man searched the dark slopes for shelter. They found it in the mouth of a shallow cave, hidden behind a curtain of vines inside. The air was damp but still warmer than the storm outside. He set down his pack and began arranging stones for a fire. The girl sat near the wall, her knees pulled to her chest. Water dripped from her hair, running down her face. "You're freezing," he said. Tossing her his dry shirt from the pack, she looked at it, hesitated, then nodded and turned away to change. When she put it on, it hung loosely on her small frame, but it was warm. The fire crackled to life, filling the cave with soft orange light. She moved closer to it, holding her hands out. Her eyes followed the flames. But her mind seemed far away. After a long silence, she spoke quietly. "My mother told me. If I survived, I must find a protector among the stars." Her voice trembled. "She said they would know me, even if I didn't know them." The man looked at her, the firelight flickering across his face. "I'm not sure I'm the one she meant," he said honestly. She shook her head slightly. "You came for me when no one else would." He didn't answer. But the truth of her words settled in the space between them. The storm outside grew louder, wind howling through the hills somewhere in the distance. A howl echoed not wind this time, but something alive. The man's hand went to the knife at his side. He stood and stepped to the cave entrance, peering through the curtain of rain. For a moment, there was only darkness, then movement, too. Shapes darting between the rocks too fast to be human. "They're here," he said in a low voice. The girl's eyes widened. He kicked dirt over the fire, plunging them into near darkness. "Stay quiet," he whispered. The shapes moved closer. But the storm's noise covered their approach. The man waited, muscles tense. When one shadow slipped into the mouth of the cave, he struck. The hunter grunted in pain as the man drove him back into the rain. The second came at him from the side, but the girl grabbed a loose stone and threw it, hitting the attacker's mask. It wasn't much, but it gave the man enough time to finish the fight. Sending the hunter rolling down the slope, the rain kept falling, washing away the blood and footprints. The man dragged the bodies out of sight and returned to the cave. The girl was still near the wall, clutching the stone, her hands trembling. "You did well," he said, surprising her. She didn't smile, but the tension in her shoulders eased a little. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. By dawn, the storm had faded, leaving the hills wet and shining in the morning light. They set out again, the path leading down toward a wide valley in the distance. She could see the faint glow of a great city under the clouds. "That's where the rebels are," she said softly. "They're the only ones who will protect me." He nodded, though his jaw tightened. The closer they got to the city, the closer the hunters would be. Every step forward was a step into greater danger. But he had made his choice. He would see her there even if it meant walking into fire again. The valley stretched out before them. At its far edge, walls of dark stone rose high, marking the city where the rebels hid. The morning air was heavy, the sky thick with low clouds. It felt as if the world was holding its breath. The man kept a firm grip on his packstrap as he scanned the horizon. The girl walked close now, her hood low over her golden eyes. Every few steps, she glanced behind them. Neither of them spoke. Both knew the hunters would make their move soon. Halfway across the valley, the first sign came a flicker of movement on the ridge to their left. The man slowed, pretending not to notice. Another shadow appeared on the right. They were surrounded. "Run when I say," he murmured to her without turning his head. She nodded, her hands tightening around the edge of her cloak. A moment later, the hunters stepped into view. 6 of them, masks glinting, weapons drawn. The leader from the inn stood at the front, his voice cold and certain. "This ends here," he said. "Give her to us, and you might live." The man didn't move. His voice was calm, almost quiet. "You'll have to take her." The leader tilted his head slightly, then gave the order. The hunters surged forward, their boots pounding against the wet earth. The man shoved the girl toward a low stone wall. "Go." She ran, but two hunters broke away to cut her off. The man charged at them, blade flashing in the gray light. The fight was brutal. One hunter swung high. The other, low, he blocked the first and kicked the second back. A blade scraped across his side, but he ignored the pain. He struck hard, sending one down into the mud. The girl had scrambled behind the wall, trying to stay hidden, but another hunter leaped over it, reaching for her. Her scream cut through the clash of steel. The man turned, rage sharpening his movements. He crashed into the attacker, tackling him to the ground. Mud splashed, hands grappled. The hunter tried to draw a hidden knife, but the man twisted his wrist until the blade fell away with one hard punch. The fight ended. More shouts came from the ridge, not hunters this time, but voices calling in the city's tongue. Figures in dark armor rushed from the gates, their weapons raised. The rebels had come. The hunters hesitated. The man used that moment. "Move." He yelled to the girl. She scrambled from behind the wall. Running toward the approaching rebels, the hunters tried to close in. But the rebels reached them first. Steel clashed, arrows flew. The valley became a storm of noise and movement. The man fought his way to her side. One hunter lunged at her, but he stepped between them, taking the strike across his arm. Blood soaked his sleeve, but he didn't fall. He drove the attacker back until rebel blades finished the job in minutes. It was over. The remaining hunters fled toward the hills. Disappearing into the mist, the rebels closed ranks around the girl. One of them, an older woman with a scar across her cheek, looked at the mark on her wrist and went still. She dropped to one knee. "Your Highness," she said in a voice that carried weight. The others followed, bowing their heads. The girl looked overwhelmed, but her eyes found the man. He was breathing hard, his coat torn, blood on his arm. She stepped toward him. Ignoring the mud and the soldiers, "You stayed," she whispered. "I told you I would," he replied. The rebel commander approached, her expression grave. "You've brought us more than you know, human," she said. "But the fight is not over. Word of her return will spread by nightfall, and the ruler's army will come." The man glanced toward the city walls, then back to the girl. Whatever lay ahead, it wouldn't be easy, for he had carried her this far, and he wasn't stopping now. The city gates groaned open. The rebels led them inside, their boots echoing on the stone road. The streets were narrow and shadowed, lined with buildings scarred by years of war. People peeked from windows as the group passed, eyes widening. When they saw the girl, whispers spread like fire. "She's alive. The heir lives." They reached a fortified hall deep within the city. Inside, the air smelled of oil lamps and old wood. The rebel commander motioned for the girl to step forward. "This is your place now," she said, her voice steady but respectful. The girl hesitated, looking first at the man. Her golden eyes seemed to ask if she was ready. He gave her a small nod. She stepped onto a raised platform where an old, faded banner hung. Its symbol was the same as the mark on her wrist. Gasps filled the room as she raised her hand, revealing it fully. The glow was brighter now. Pulsing like a heartbeat, the rebels knelt as one. "Your Highness," they said in unison. The man stayed near the back. He wasn't part of this world, he knew that, but as he watched her stand under the banner, taller now than when he'd first seen her in that cage, he felt something shift. She wasn't just the frightened girl he had rescued. She was becoming the leader she was born to be. Later, in a quiet chamber, she came to him. Her cloak had been replaced with the royal colors of her house, deep blue with silver edges. "You're leaving?" she said softly. He looked away for a moment before answering. "This is your fight now." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "It was never just my fight," she replied. "You bled for me. You carried me through fire and rain. You stayed when you could have walked away." He didn't know what to say to that. "I'm not a prince or a knight," he said finally. She stepped closer. "I don't need a prince," she said, her voice firm. "I need someone I can trust." Outside, the city bells began to ring. A scout rushed in, bowing quickly. "The ruler's army is on the move, thousands, marching." Here, the rebel commander's voice was sharp. "Prepare the walls. No one leaves the city." The man glanced at the girl. She looked at him, not with fear this time, but with resolve. "Will you stand with me?" she asked. His answer came without hesitation. Yes. The next hours were a blur. The rebels armed themselves, barricading the streets from the walls. They could see the enemy like a dark tide spilling across the valley. The girl stood beside the man at the highest point, her cloak snapping in the wind. The commander approached, offering her a ceremonial blade. She took it, but then turned and handed it to the man. "You lead beside me," she said so only he could hear. "They will follow you as they follow me." The enemy struck before sunset. Arrows darkened the sky, and the gates shook under the battering rams. The man fought at the front, the girl not far behind, rallying the rebels with words that burned in their hearts. Every time the enemy tried to reach her, the man was there. Steel met steel. The air filled with smoke and shouts. Hours passed. The tide began to turn. The enemy broke, retreating into the night. The city stood bloodied, battered, but unbroken at dawn. The rebels gathered in the great hall. The girl stood before them, the man at her side. "This human saved me when the galaxy had given up," she said, voice carrying to every corner. "He is my protector, my advisor, and my family." The rebels cheered, the sound rolling through the hall and out into the waking city. The man didn't speak, but inside, he knew the truth. He had gone to the market that day, expecting nothing. One choice, one quiet whisper of all taker had changed his life forever. Now it had changed the fate of worlds, and as the sunlight streamed through the high windows, she looked at him with a small, knowing smile, the kind that promised this was only the beginning.